Hey, good evening, everybody. It's my privilege to introduce tonight Colonel Chris Conlin, who joins us from Sacramento, where he is currently the Assistant City Manager for Public Safety with executive oversight of the police and fire departments, the Office of Community Response, Office of Emergency Management, and the Youth Parks and Community Endowment Enrichment Department. Previously, he was an interim fire chief and the director of Parks and Recreation in Sacramento. And prior to joining the city of Sacramento, Chris served as Governor Jerry Brown's deputy director off-highway vehicle recreation and boating and waterways in the California Department of Parks and Recreation. And tonight he will tell us a bit about how he was prepared for the rigors of city management in Sacramento by some unique on-the-job experience in Iraq. Colonel Conlin retired from the Marine Corps after 30 years of service. He was commissioned following graduation from the University of Rochester, New York in 1981. As a Marine officer, he held a variety of operational and training assignments, ranging from platoon commander to leading a 1,500 personnel combat battalion. In between, he served as a commander of a combined Marine and Navy SEAL Special Operations Unit during operations in the Middle East. Combat experience included leading a Marine infantry company of 200 Marines in the liberation of Kuwait during Operation Desert Storm and leading a battalion task force during the liberation of Iraq. As a battalion commander in Iraq, Chris found himself serving as the provincial governor of Najaf province, which is the equivalent in population and area of the state of New Hampshire. We are honored to have Colonel Conlin with us tonight and eager to hear about his making transition from combat operations to being a public administrator using soft power. We'll hold our questions until his presentation's finished. And if you want to do it, address your questions via chat to me, and then I'll relay them to the Colonel. So with that, I turn the floor over to Colonel Conlin.
Hey, thanks very much, Mike. I appreciate it. And thank you, Christine. And I am absolutely honored to be able to talk to everybody here tonight. I'm going to do my squirrely thing with the video here for a second. So if I look distracted, it's because I am. Can I get a thumbs up, Mike? Is that working? We're good. Okay. All right. So I kind of like to start off any lecture I give or brief with a story. And I think this is a compelling story that you're going to find kind of stitches everything together, the soft power, the hard power, and some life lessons. So I'm sitting in the governing council in Najaf. I'm feeling pretty good. You know, we just got this thing kicked off. This is basically we've liberated Iraq, and this is the first representative government they've had in about 10,000 years. So my day is going pretty well. Next thing I know, I look out the window and there's a crowd of 5,000 people walking down the street. They're obviously heading to our city hall, probably to sack the mayor. So much for my great day. I go running out of the chambers, jump my Humvee, driver's taking me over to City Hall. I'm on the radio, I call for reinforcements, and we make a beeline for City Hall. The crowd is obviously really angry, and I know that they're going to overwhelm the few Marines I've got guarding the main gate at City Hall. I get there, and my reaction force still hasn't arrived, but the crowd is surging. My interpreter, fortunately, is with me, and he starts interpreting, and he starts listening to what they're saying. The crowd believes that we have imprisoned a guy by the name of Muqtada al-Sadr. So he's been preaching anti-US rhetoric at the Kufa Mosque, and he's leading an insurgent group that he calls the Mahdi Army. Now, Muqtada is not known for his religious acumen in Najaf. And Najaf is like the Vatican City for the Shia. It's where the Hausa is, it's where the Grand Ayatollahs are. There's all sorts of religious scholarship there. So he's kind of in a tough crowd. But he's the son of a martyred Ayatollah. So his name really has great sway with many of his followers. More importantly, Muqadda''s not locked up. And I know that because local sources have told us that he's hiding out at his mother's house. The crowd is also artificial. They're not from Najaf. My crowd, my chaplain and the counterintelligence team have waded in, disguised, passing out cold water in the brutal heat, and angry voices have kind of turned to happy mouths that are getting sued. And they start talking to my folks, and they start telling them, yeah, we were in Baghdad, we got offered rides down here on buses, we came down for the day, and Muqtada told us that, you know, we would be able to be in the city, and we got word that he was taken prisoner. This is basically a rent-a-riot. They got this free ride down, got out of the ghettos in Baghdad that they had been living in. So participating in a riot really is kind of a small price to pay, but that was important information to us. The 5,000 are now packed into kind of a narrow walled road, and they're surging at my guards that are guarding the gate to City Hall. There's only about 12 of them. My quick reaction force arrives nearby, and they start forming up for a possible confrontation. So I start engaging with the mullahs, and they're controlling the crowd. These guys are all of Sadr's kind of lieutenants. I tell them that Sadr is not in our custody, that in fact, we know he is fine. They're adamant. We lock them up. While we argue, snipers are getting up on the roofs of the buildings nearby. I've got heavy weapons vehicles showing up on the flanks of the crowd, and my very visible reaction force of about 100 well-armed Marines are setting up in skirmish lines also on the flanks of the crowd. The advantage is now back with us, so it's time to shift the momentum. My interpreter starts announcing over a loudspeaker that the crowd has been lied to, that Sadr is a free man, and they're desecrating the holy city of Najaf by doing this rioting. The crowd wavers a little bit. They're hot, they're tired, they're starting to question why they're there, but the mullahs quickly reinvigorate them. They're ratcheting up the chanting, they're pushing the rhetoric. On cue, families start moving up front, and they start sitting in lines in front of my Marines at the gate. And then they start moving up, leapfrogging, one group sitting down in front of the other, physically trying to push us back. It's now or never. I turn from the mullahs, I lock eyes with my lieutenant in charge at the gates, and slowly, loudly, as distinctly as possible, I command, stand by, fix, bayonets. Instantly, without hesitation, the Marine guards lock steel blades onto rifle barrels. The lieutenant turns to them and immediately yells, on guard, and they move into attack position. I want you to hold that thought for just a minute. We're going to get back to this one. So, tonight, we're going to discuss a topic that most of you don't expect to hear from a combat Marine. We're going to talk about the use of soft power. But I assure you, warriors like Sun Tzu, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Westmoreland, to name a few, were all masters of soft power. They knew soft power was a critical element of combat, which is why they're also considered statesmen in their own right. Von Clausewitz said, war is politics by other means. So war is supporting component of the political objective. It's not an end in itself. Military and political leaders must be agile enough to shift quickly between the states of politics, but understand ultimately politics will set the resolution of any situation, not necessarily combat. That's the way of the world. That's immutable. Caesar, Alexander, even our own George Washington weren't great tacticians. They were great statesmen. They knew how to deftly shift between these means of political power. Okay, so I kind of left you hanging with a bunch of Marines with bayonets against an angry crowd. I really owe you a little bit of background and context. So in August of 2002, I took command of 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. It's about 1,000 Marines. They were called the first team, and they were home based in 29 Palms, California. Just 6 months prior to going to Iraq, that battalion had been in Okinawa. In fact, when I picked them up, they had just come off the planes. But in short order, after coming back from Okinawa, over 50% of the battalion got rotated out. And we got in about 400 brand new Marines, literally off of the boot camps, out of the boot camps in Lejeune and Camp Pendleton. So that's also kind of a normal thing. Unfortunately, not changed by the fact that we knew shortly we would probably be going to Iraq because things were ratcheting up. We did know that we could spend every possible moment training because that was afforded to us. And we emphasized the basics. We built up small unit expertise in agile, innovative tactics, and we really, really emphasized independent thinking. I know that sounds strange from a Marine, but my experience from combat was independent thinkers win battles. On the 1st of February, 2003, we were sent to Kuwait. We were in austere staging areas, and we started getting ready for the assault. Still training, still getting ready, but we were adding personnel even at that point. New Marines coming in. We joined specialized units, got Army Psychological Operations Unit attached. We had United Kingdom Explosive Ordnance Detail and Signal Intelligence attached to us. Counterintelligence units, engineers were attached to us. We even had media teams, like from CNN, Marty Savage, the Washington Post, John Feiner, who later went to the State Department. The Chicago Union Tribune reporter was attached to us. And we had a combat author by the name of Bing West. In fact, you'll see there was a list of references for this lecture. And one of the references is Bing West's book, The March Up, which talks about our time together during this particular stage in the battle. So we crossed the Kuwaiti border on 20 March, and our first objective was called the Crown Jewel. It was a major oil pumping node near Basra. We were told it was a critical pathway for 14% of the world order, of world's oil, had to be seized. Definitely a critical part of the Iraqi economy. After a successful seizure, we turned it over to the United Kingdom's Army, crossed the ancient Euphrates River, and then we took off through what had been the ancient marsh area of Iraq, now basically dry desert, on our way towards Baghdad. We cleared Fedayeen along that route. We conducted counterinsurgency operations. We seized multiple airfields, and we launched a mechanized assault, destroying the Baghdad division in the vicinity of Al-Qut. From there, we crossed the Tigris River now, and we headed northwest, driving towards Baghdad. Along the route, we seized the Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission. Yeah, they weren't producing anything, but it was ready to go. It was turnkey. By April 9th, we were doing our final objective, final assault into downtown Baghdad. This was over 400 miles of fighting that we did to get up there. Final assault in Baghdad, we wound up seizing Embassy Row. It was an area called the Thumb. That was a polite name for it. We also seized Baghdad University, and we wound up taking Tariq Aziz's palace. In fact, some of you probably watched the statue getting pulled down that day. Interesting, we were hearing that over the radio that victory had been declared, and we were in a massive firefight at Baghdad University right at the same time. So here's a nice shot, a fun one. So that's some of my Marines after they knocked over Tariq Aziz's house. Tariq, we believe, was watching us from the Palestine Hotel, and they're enjoying a massive amount of Cohiba cigars that we ran into that were all provided by Tariq's great friend, Fidel Castro. And here's Tariq, his little card they left as a calling card there, and he's enjoying the fact that we got his house. So sometimes the spoils of war work out. But while we were kind of enjoying this in our revelry, what we didn't realize was around us, we had suddenly become the owners of an area about the size of Manhattan in downtown Baghdad. But the locals knew that. In fact, the locals, shortly after the firefight stopped, started showing up with their requests. And the requests were for city services. The requests were for police. The requests were for electricity. The requests for all those things that all of us expect out of our city government. We were suddenly the instant city managers, but we were still fighting. I mean, we still had gunfights going on in streets, but at the same time, we had to take care of this population. We owned it. We were suddenly the dog catchers. We were suddenly the police. We were the courts. We were providing electricity. We were turning on the water. We were picking up garbage, all of that. We had to recalibrate on the fly. We went from full combat, literally warm barrels on weapons, to a municipal government within the space of minutes. So another thing that I included, along with my references, was an article I wrote. And the article was called, "What Do You Do for an Encore?" It talks about this specific time in Baghdad. But this entry in my journal that I described in the article basically says it all. This is what we were feeling. You know, where the hell was the government? Who was in charge? Well, it was us. It was us. And we had to make the best do that we could. But I have to tell you, this was not what we were planning for. In fact, we had been assured the previous December by a group from Rand Corporation that we would be bypassing cities, that most likely all we would do is show up on the outskirts of Baghdad and basically, like the old days around castles, we would set up around it and allow it to collapse from within, basically put a siege line out. Well, and then as soon as that happened and Baghdad fell, we'd shortly be replaced by the pros from Dover, who would come in and manage all of the post-conflict reconstruction and stability. That was supposed to be the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, the infamous ORHA, that was supposed to be under retired General Jay Gardner. Well, they may have showed, but for us, they were a no-show. We were on our own. We were on our own trying to figure it out as we went and trying to do the best we could. Now, as we were making this paradigm shift, still fighting the remnants of the regime, but at the same time running the city, believe it or not, we actually had good success. None of us were trained in this. We had a couple of references. We had stuff like the Small Wars Manual, and some of us remember taking political science courses and civics back in school. So we did the best we could. What we really found was if we focused simply on the needs of the population and allowed them to build trust in us, that things went okay. That basically using gut feeling and common sense, we were able to do a lot. So we did that for about 2 weeks, right around Easter time. And because we had some success, our reward was we got sent a couple hundred miles away and basically became the provisional government for Najaf. Now, Najaf is a province in the southwest of Iraq. It's about 1.3 million people and about 11,000 square miles. And we were a 1,500 person task force that were running that huge province about the size of New Hampshire. It's a strategically significant place, especially the city of Najaf. As I said, it's the Vatican for the Shia, with the Hausa of Grand Ayatollahs there and the colleges and seminaries surrounding. It's also the location of the largest cemetery in the world, where all good Shia come to get buried. And it's a location for traditional Hajj that takes place coming from Iran, the largest Shia population, going across much of Iraq to visit both Najaf and then to the north, the city of Karbala. It was also the starting point for the 1920 revolution against British rule, a successful revolution, by the way. So it was not a place that was unfamiliar with revolutionary against occupying powers. And it was also one of the key locations during the Shia rebellion following Desert Storm. You may remember that an unfortunate statement by President Bush at the time caused many in Iraq to think that we were going to come in and help them overthrow the government. Well, they started the rebellion mostly in Basra, but in Najaf as well, and we didn't show. As a result, thousands suffered Saddam's suppression of that rebellion. They were reported to have been executed in mass killings and torture on the steps of the Imam Ali Temple, which they quite often showed us. Their shrines and their cemetery were desecrated. And Baghdad essentially started a systematic genocidal neglect of the population. They just ignored them, essentially, and allowed them to die on the vine. So when the attack came, when the coalition forces were seizing Iraq, Najaf was one of the early objectives. The Army actually went in there, the 101st Airborne. And there was actually a plan that ORA had put together for Najaf because they knew its significance. And that was to bring in an expat by the name of Alcoy. So Alcoy was the son of a deceased Grand Ayatollah. Try not to butcher this name. My daughter's the one that speaks Arabic. Ayatollah Abu al-Qassam Alcoy. And both he and his father had been involved in the 91 uprising. And then after that, he escaped to London, the younger son did, and started managing what's called the Alcoy Foundation. He was flown in by US and UK agents shortly after Najaf fell on the 3rd of April, but he was assassinated less than a week later, right at the same time Baghdad was falling on the 10th of April. Bad news for everybody. After that, Orha's successor, the Coalition Provisional Authority, that was the one that Ambassador Paul Brenner was running, deemed Najaf a powder keg waiting to go off. Lucky us. We got to go take care of the powder keg. So how do you do that? Sun Tzu, Caesar, Alexander all said you need to know your enemies and your competitors. We sought to do that. Another famous general by the name of General Tony Zinni, who later worked as an emissary for the US, had taught us that hug tactics deny the enemy the initiative. So it was going to be important that we were out amongst the population. Our center of gravity was going to be the support of the population. By maximizing our interaction with the locals via saturation patrols, civic projects, the media, key social, political, and religious groups, we create a level of trust and understanding that safeguarded our Marines, won out the threats, and allowed them to prosper. We immediately started setting the conditions for that. First thing we did was we traded in our 46-ton armored personnel carriers. They look like big giant tanks for less threatening trucks. We traded in artillery and tanks for Army Civil Affairs groups. We brought in Psyops teams. We brought in military police. We also brought in Naval Civil Engineers, or CBs, to build stuff, because if they had been left to wither on the vine, we needed to get in there and build things up for them. We occupied the Najaf University, which provided much needed security not only for the staff who felt threatened, but also their facilities. We mandated some basic principles. First off, General Mattis had told us the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. So we went in there with the attitude that we weren't going to roll in like the 800-pound gorilla and start breaking systems that were already working. We also used his mantra of no better friend, no worse enemy, which is now the mantra of the division that he commanded, and sort of the secondary mantra of the Marine Corps. We had some very basic but effective rules. We started doing these in Baghdad, but brought them with us to Najaf, and that was wave, be friendly, talk to everybody, take off your sunglasses when you're talking to people because the locals wanted to see your eyes, not your shades. Obey the traffic signs, like a good example. Don't point weapons at people unless you're threatened. So don't look like you're scared pointing them at everybody. Give deference to the women and children, as the culture does. Watch your language and try and learn their language while you're there. And obey the cultural taboos. We also amped up some of the other lessons we learned from Baghdad, and that was to create intensive information gathering. We needed to know every aspect of the city. Instead of worrying about enemy locations, we were worried about stuff like, what was the infrastructure status? What were the population needs? Who were the local power brokers? What was criminal and terrorist that was going on in the city? What was the social structure? We utilized the 1,500 Marines as both collectors and injectors, because they can inject messaging too at the population as they met them. And we did that by saturation patrols, not in vehicles, on foot, walking around, meeting the same people, and keeping the same patrols in the same locations so that we could build rapport, like community policing back here in the States. We eagerly sought to meet our residents and potential competitors, because you got to talk to the bad guys too, and found our first and foremost critical opportunity right on our doorstep. So the Shia Hajj, just so happened, was in full swing right when we got there. This is hundreds of thousands moving on roads, walking to the main temple in Najaf, the Imam Ali shrine, and then going up the northern roads to Karbala. And this was because one of the Imams, Ali, had been martyred in Kufa and then was buried in the Imam Ali shrine, or the location where the Imam Ali shrine is now. So this Hajj had not happened in many, many years because of Baghdad's intervention. This was going to be a real test of whether these people could feel free. And they were doing it for that exact reason. I mean, obviously they were doing the pilgrimage because it was something important to them, but it was also a little bit of a test. They wanted to see if, no kidding, America really was going to allow them to do this. They needed our security. We needed their support. So it all kind of started, oddly enough, with a water buffalo. Now, the water buffalo is that odd-looking barrel thing that you see up in the upper right. It's basically a big water tank that gives potable water and we drink out of. We asked everybody, hey, what do you guys need? We want to help. And the first thing they said was, give us water. And then they said, and then do traffic control. And that's exactly what we did. We brought out as many of those as we could, parked them along the streets, started doing traffic control, started issuing out food to them. We got along pretty well. They liked it. It wasn't complete trust, but it was a start. And we started building open communication as well. Camaraderie and mutual reliance builds trust. So they now found that we could be supportive, and they found that when they needed stuff, we could help them a little bit. It was an important first step. We built on that rapidly. A couple of days after we arrived, we challenged the local team to a soccer game. We did it in the city stadium. People thought I was nuts. I mean, they were like, those guys still want to kill you. We didn't think so. We thought we really needed to link into them. It was incredible. The whole city turned out, especially the young kids. Now, they beat us soundly. Combat boots don't work as cleats, but they loved it. And by the end of it, you can see the fist shakes and hand grabs and all of that were going on with the local team. It was huge. Everybody enjoyed it. It was a good way to bring down. They had never seen anything like that with Saddam or his agents before. Next thing, my engineers found that there was an old amusement park in Najaf. Now, the amusement park had been built for the Baathists that were there, and they were the only ones allowed to use it. Well, we went in, we fixed it, we got everything running. Those CBs figured out how to make the stuff go lickety quick. And instead of being only for the Baathists, we brought everybody in. Well, I'll tell you what, there's nothing like giving a kid a chance to ride on a carousel to really get mom and dad out there and really get them yakking. And that's exactly what happened. It broke down a lot of barriers. We weren't the bad guys. We were the good guys that opened up the park for the kids. And they really appreciated that too. But the city was really very much an enigma to the folks in Baghdad. All they saw when they looked at Najaf was the Islamic Dawah Party and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq that were major players there and were big concerns to the CIA and to other intelligence groups that were advising the folks in Baghdad. Primarily because there was the perception, especially there was more than a perception with Scary, that they were getting all their marching orders from Iran and that they couldn't be trusted. Now, of those two, Dawah was sort of the home team. When everything blew up in '91, they stayed. They suffered all of the consequences of that. Many of them were killed by Saddam. Many of them went into hiding, but they were there at the end when we took down Saddam, and they were ready to play again. Scary was the away team. When everything happened in '91, many of them became expats, went across the Iranian border, and basically fought against Saddam in anticipation of someday coming back to Iraq. But there was bad blood between these two parties because Dawah looked at him, at Scary like, hey, you guys left when things got bad. And of course, Scary looked at Dawah and said, well, you know, you guys didn't do much, even though you stayed here. We were the ones that were shedding blood. So that was tough for us. CIA was particularly concerned about the fact that Sciri had this agency called Vader Corps that was very well aligned with some of the Iraqi the Iranian agencies that they didn't like. And they were afraid that Vader Corps was going to come in and basically take over Najaf. They weren't completely wrong. I'm sure there were a lot of folks from Vader Corps there, but that was because many of them lived in Najaf before 91, and they just wanted to come back home. We really couldn't operate based on distant perception. We had to operate by feel, and that's what we did. So I didn't listen to a lot of the scare tactics coming from Baghdad. We just made it work with what we had. Part of that was engaging on all levels of the city infrastructure, from restarting electric and water to opening the schools and establishing the courts. Some of those easier than others. The city electricity came from a German power plant that had basically been operating on chewing gum and baling wire. It died shortly after Najaf fell. Like so much else there, it was just a casualty of benign neglect from Baghdad. We had our attached engineers go in there. They managed to finally find somebody that had worked there, and they were able to retool and get parts from the 3 generators so they get at least one working. That gave us 24/7 power. That was huge. The rest of the country still had intermittent power at best. The reliable power allowed the economy to open, which was primarily based in Najaf on tourism and religious scholarship. They lived off all of these people coming into the city. And it allowed the residents to start using their information sources like satellite TV, satellite radios, satellite phones. You notice the theme there? That was the other important thing. When Saddam was in power, they didn't get a lot of information from outside unless you were a Ba'athist. You didn't have satellite radios, you didn't have satellite TV, but it was like a mushroom farm as soon as Baghdad fell. And it allowed people to find out what the rest of the world was doing. That was helpful to us because we were about to expose them to a lot of change, and they had to be ready for that change. Eventually, Baghdad came down and said they wanted our power because they were having problems with theirs. We told them power's too unstable and effectively gave them a terse hell no. They never came back and bothered us. That's because it was nice being on the outskirts of the empire. But more and more Baghdad-centric issues started popping up and haunting us. For the Shia, that had been a way of life. So it was going to be very important that we severed those ties and just allowed them to operate on their own. As soon as we arrived, our legal officer had said, hey, we need to vet the courts and reestablish the rule of law. I kind of snidely looked at him and said, you know, hey, I thought first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Isn't that what Henry V said? And then I said, besides, isn't this the place where they wrote Hammurabi's Code? Are we really, and that's Hammurabi's Code there on the left, aren't we really kind of out of our league? Well, he was right, and he did. They went in, they vetted the courts, they made sure that all of the judges were not Ba'athists, they were upright, you know, good folks, dug out all of the old legal system, which was French-based, and got them up and running literally within the first month we were there. It was one of the best things we did. It created a sense of order following the chaos of war and collapse of the Ba'athists. One of the Najafi judges actually wound up being the investigating judge for Saddam Hussein when they captured him. And that was not the least of which because we were the only ones that really had our courts up and running. So they went to us to pick somebody out. Locally, it allowed us to create the police force. Other places were creating police, but they didn't have courts. We had a court system first, then we created the police, so the police had some place to take the criminals. Worked out well. We did that with a 2-week ethics course for the police, followed by a 4 weeks operation academy, because we just needed to get something kick-started. And eventually it allowed us to prosecute a corrupt mayor and a problematic political antagonist, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. One great tool that was not originally set up for success was our Army Psyops team. They came with minimal equipment, but great talent and imagination. In fact, the lieutenant in charge of it was a Princeton grad, brilliant guy. We made an early decision to reopen TV and radio stations and newspapers as free press, not controlled by us, I could have. I had martial law. They were made free press. Our Psyops team offered tech expertise and mentoring, but they didn't impose any content control. The only rule we had was no advocacy of violence. And we told them we wanted every week a PSA. That PSA became my fireside chat. Once a week, I'd sit down and for 30 minutes with an interpreter, I talked to the city. It was one of the most popular shows on TV because we told them what was going on, everything, Baghdad, the whole 9 yards, and it gave them a lot of comfort. In addition, the Psyops started operating well outside of their box. They had a very hierarchical in the Army approval process for anything they put out, any kind of material. We broke that chain immediately. And basically they were operating just within the city, doing what they thought was best. They created TV info commercials. It was called It's Better in Iraq. You heard that one before? It's better in New York. We did It's Better in Iraq. And the city really liked it because they were tourists, or it was a tourism-based economy. So they liked using that outside the city. It was important to them that people thought Najaf was safe. We also work with a lot of the US and Arab networks. Now, I got in a lot of trouble for working with those Arab networks like Al Jazeera, Hezbollah, and Al Arabiya because that Baghdad didn't want us talking to them. But if I didn't talk to them, I didn't talk to the people because they watched their news on satellite. And they were going to watch Al Jazeera and they were going to watch Al Arabiya. So if I wasn't talking to them, they were going to get a different message. It was important that we were all speaking the same language. We had a very effective information campaign. And what it allowed us to do was to outcycle the competition, who in many regards were people that were trying to rile up the population by giving them mistruths, by giving them misinformation about what was really going on. But it wouldn't have worked unless we gave that freedom of press so that we had transparency and legitimacy. All of this was completely against CPA guidance and Psyops protocol, interestingly enough. But we saw free press as the key to legitimacy by creating trust and transparency. Some lessons learned, just by the way, is that Psyops really, and they may be better now, but they really didn't have the equipment to do what they needed to do. What they really needed was not big loudspeakers on top of Humvees. They needed production equipment. They needed folks that were trained in production equipment. They needed high-speed printers. They needed portable civilian TV and radio transmitters so that they could provide that to the population instead of allowing them to use their ancient, test tube or tube-driven radios and all of that stuff, and they could get messages out faster. We fabricated all this, but it took us precious time. Establishing normal social constraints was also critical. Najaf is a city of religious scholars. We needed to reopen schools, particularly the elementary classrooms that had been decimated by the Ba'athist. At the same time, we wanted to create representative government, something that people of Najaf had never truly experienced. Early on, we had a chance to do both. Najaf needed to reestablish their school board following the departure of the Baghdad-appointed Baptists who previously ran it. Courageously, the school administration decided to do an election, and they invited me to be the senior government official. It was glorious. I sat on a high school theater stage with my sergeant major and various school officials and candidates. They started slow, a lot of nervous glances at me, see if I was really going to let them run it free. Quickly progressed into a vibrant, controlled chaos that any of us would recognize from a local caucus here in the United States. All the enthusiastic candidate speeches, all the pro and con yelling from the crowd. At the end of the day, they counted the votes, picked the new board, introduced them, and the room exploded in jubilation. They were free. And that's what the face of freedom looks like down there in the right-hand corner. That's one of the little girls that was there. First time she'd ever seen freedom in her life, but that was just reflective of what we saw on the faces of that entire room that day. So our next step, bigger, was to create the Najaf Province Governing Council. So Najaf, we said, is about the size of New Hampshire, but about 90% of the people live in the twin cities of Najaf and Kufa. They're basically right next to each other. Kufa's ancient, Najaf's a little bit newer, if you're talking thousands of years newer. We needed a council, so we set up a caucus-type selection committees. Civil Affairs put this together with support from all of us. We started with the most basic questions. What sort of government does Najaf need and want? Again, we hit books. Small Wars Manual has chapters on how to do this. We looked at the Federalist Papers. We looked at Machiavelli. We looked at parliamentary charters. We kludged together with them basically what a governing council could look like. But it reflected their social and political landscape, not ours, not Jeffersonian democracy, Najafi democracy. So on their council, they had borough reps, they had engineer society reps, they had a clergy rep, they had a women's rep, they had an agricultural rep, they had a tribes rep. All of these were important parts of their society. So they wanted them represented. It was something significant to them. The selection process was also purposely decentralized. Basically, each of the groups defined how they wanted to run things, but it was under our tutelage. So we had people that advised them and said, here's how you can do things, because they've never done elections before. So we had to kind of coach them on how to do this in a fair manner. The first order of business was, and by the way, very well accepted throughout the community. When we sat this council, we never heard a peep about anybody about the wrong people or anything. We did hear that about the mayor, though. The first order of business was to write their charter. And they tackled that, and as much as we gave them, with gusto, from crafting budgets to creating new laws. One of their initial actions also was to find their mayor, who I just mentioned, unfit to lead after those free courts of ours found him guilty of embezzlement, false imprisonment, and dishonesty. He was the first mayor ever legally impeached, and it was the first time I ever got to run a peaceful coup. Pretty cool. But we'll talk more about him in a couple minutes. Okay, so I want to get you back to the Alcoa incident that we had been talking about and my friend Muqtada al-Sadr. So we left him hiding somewhere and we left this huge crowd. But let's talk a little bit more about who he was. So remember Mr. Alcoa? We talked about him earlier. He was not just murdered on the 10th of April. He was attacked by a crowd of sword-wielding assassins in the most sacred temple of Aman Ali and allowed to bleed out as he staggered to the doorstep of Muqtada al-Sadr. Depending on who you believe, Muqtada either ignored him and allowed him to die or told the crowd to finish him off. Our judges in our vetted court were already putting together a warrant for al-Sadr. But at this point, Sadr had developed quite the following. It just wasn't in Najaf. As Baghdad had fallen, he went into the city and specifically into a Shia slum called Saddam City. And he had significant backing from Iran where he had been hiding out. That's where he'd been since his grand Ayatollah father had been assassinated by Saddam in Najaf in 1999. So he had the name recognition from his dad, and he used the local mosque as a very robust social welfare network with all sorts of food and supplies and everything that Iran was supplying him. This was really smart. It turned him into an instant hero. And the grateful residents that were there named that old slum that was Saddam City into a new name, Sadr City, after him and his father. They became an instant coalition for him, an instant constituency. So here's the interesting part. Sadr City is about a half mile from the green zone, okay, just off to the west. And that's where CPA was. And between these two places, Sadr City and the green zone, was the Palestine Hotel. Now, the Palestine Hotel had become the de facto site for all the international media. It's where they were when Baghdad fell, and they kind of stayed in that hotel. So every time Sadr wanted attention, he would rally all his troops in Sadr City, thousands of them, march them over towards the green zone, under the nose of all those reporters in the Palestine Hotel. It made him look like the strong man in Baghdad. it made him look like he was the natural leader, because every time they looked out their window, they saw what you see there in the upper right, flags talking about al-Sadr and he's great and everything else. This rent-a-congregation is the same guys that showed up in our Najaf. And as long as he kept them better supplied than both the CPA and the Iraqi General Council that was just forming, which wasn't hard to do, these people were going to be loyal to him. So he would bring these folks down into Najaf on Friday nights, and he would preach there. That was the place his dad used to preach, in Kufa Mosque. And he looked again like a strong man, except for the fact that in Najaf, he was considered not to be religiously significant. They knew he wasn't sophisticated. They despised Sadr, and they saw him really as a uneducated Ayatollah wannabe. He was 29 years old. In that part of the country, they don't even listen to you until you're 40. So he really was considered to be an upstart. Older clerics and the devout openly denigrated his sermons as childish. We use this tension to mitigate Muqtada's stature. In media releases and interviews, we followed the local penchant. We call him young or youngster. Being well over 40 myself, that seemed to work well in my fireside chats, since, obviously I looked long in the tooth, and in my interactions with the other media folks, and they started picking up on it. The 5,000 visiting protesters from my intro were there that day to show up at the mosque, and when Sadr wasn't there and they were told he was being held captive, they were redirected to do this protest. And this was a direct affront to our mitigation efforts, but it didn't work. Why? Because of all the soft power we've been expending up to that point. Because our reputation was starting to become stronger than his. Because even though we were outsiders, we were supporting the city. But wait a minute. I left you with a bunch of Marines and bayonets facing off an angry crowd of civilians. As Charles Osgood likes to say, now for the rest of the story. So the crowd sees the bayonets and the Marines in fighting stance, and they immediately stop their forward movement. Just as importantly, the council I had left behind in their chambers has now had time to personally or via messengers tell the protesters and the mullahs that Sadr's lying. And they have evidence. And what's the evidence? The evidence comes from the TV station, because al-Sadr kidnapped one of their reporters and brought him to his mother's house and was pretending like he was surrounded and trying to transmit and get the reporter to report that. But the reporter didn't report that, because the reporter had been taught how to use press as a free press. So he got the word out to his buddies that, hey, this isn't right. He's not surrounded. He's in his mom's house. He's all alone. There's nobody here. So the people now start to realize they've been duped, and the people start wondering why they're risking fighting Marines with bayonets. In a spontaneous reaction, the crowd begins leaving, not just for downtown, but for the buses that left them, that brought them there. The mullahs try to save face. They've got a bunch of international press there by this time, and they start claiming that Sadr escaped. But the press is the real story. Where did they get it from? They're talking to the local TV guys and from the protesters that are leaving. It's done. No blood, no loss of the mayor, and Sadr has now been exposed to the world as a liar. Now, 6 weeks earlier, U.S. forces confronted a similar angry crowd. They opened fire, and 15 people were killed. The name of that city was Fallujah. That Fallujah. The press also noticed this difference, and they started reporting the fact that this one went right. That even though bayonets were unsheathed, there was no loss of blood, or no loss of life, no bloodletting.
that basically the crowd was turned away and that Sadr had been shown to be a liar. That was big. What was bigger was that this was a big win for the council because they were instrumental in resolving this. And it became a subject of my fireside chat. And even more significantly, it validated us allowing free press because the press were the ones that really reported the truth. And they won a lot of favor for that from the community. Of course, we still had a challenge with Sadr. Baghdad's response was branding Sadr a terrorist, which only served to increase his stature. Not at all what I needed. I knew our courts were still hot on his investigation regarding Al-Qawi, but that still was not ripe for a warrant. But I also knew that Sadr was a false prophet in Najaf, and he didn't have any credibility. He was his own worst enemy, in fact, every time he was in a public forum, because he tripped over his words and just said things that were awful. So his greatest assets really were his name and the Sadr City mobile constituency. If we went after him too strongly, we'd make him more than he was, and we'd create a martyr like his father. And in that part of the country, if you're a martyr, you're a big deal. So we did not want to do that. Diminishing his following and discrediting his message would mitigate and marginalize his impact. So we did that. First, we stripped away his constituency. That was really simple. 1st Marine Division headquarters simply hired away every bus in Baghdad every Friday. No bus, no mobile constituency, no congregation in Kufa. And the bus drivers got a free day off on their holy day. They loved it. It was huge. To diminish his stature, we worked closely with the Najaf Governing Council in Naja. He was already a big thorn in their side. They really did not like him. He was embarrassing to them. So they were more than happy to point out the incongruity in his religious opinions and social declarations. Ultimately, Sadr found himself marginalized while folks like Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who led the Hausa, the Dawa Party, and even Skiri ascended. Much more happened, but those are kind of some of the initial highlights. What was more important to me were the things that didn't happen. So shortly after that Sadr protest, our judges did indict our mayor. And that was the corruption charges I talked about. Mayor Munin was an interesting guy. He had been appointed by the CIA shortly after the death of their intended mayor, who was that Mr. Al-Qawi we talked about. So Mayor Munin was an Army colonel. He ran a resistance group that was linked to the pre-invasion operations that were being orchestrated by CIA and other three-letter organizations. To the agents, this guy looked like an Iraqi George Washington, but he was an outsider. He was from Basra. And even worse for Najaf, he was a Sufi. Now, to a devout Shia, a Sufi is considered a heretic. So that was offensive to them. Of course, I couldn't fire him for that. Not me, the big-time, purveyor of democracy. Nor could I fire him for the fact that the townspeople used to tell me he's only got one leg. Sounds like a Monty Python skit, but apparently he lost a leg in the war, and they didn't like that he only had one leg. Can't fire him for that either. But I could sack him for corruption. And we did so in a bloodless coup one boiling day. And as it happened, there was no loss of life in that either. We walked on in, took him out, brought him outside, put him in a helicopter, and flew him, Christine, to Abu Ghraib prison, as a matter of fact, and never heard from him again. Now, that could have created a constitutional emergency in the city because we just removed their mayor. But that didn't happen. The governing council had an emergency session. They freely endorsed the assistant mayor to be the acting mayor. He was a lifetime public servant in Najaf with great local support. He instantly accepted, and it was a great day. But we had a test of our charter now. Because in this case, where they had a temporary mayor, it called for a special election for a new mayor as soon as possible. So that had already been in the works. We had been trying to put together elections for the mayor regardless, but it really moved up the timeline. So once again, Baghdad got involved. They sent down election experts because they wanted to see what we were doing. To their surprise, all the safeguards and protocols were in place for a fair and viable election. But that wasn't enough. A debate ensued about whether the right candidate would win. I was amazed. The guardians of democracy were upset that the people of Najaf might elect someone Paul Bremer didn't like. We traveled to the Green Zone, to the palace, to make our pitch to him, and were summarily ignored by Bremer's palace staff. On the eve of the election, we got a call from the CPA telling us to cancel it. The city went from election day euphoria to the old feelings of Baghdad suppression and autocracy. I tried to offset the anger by taking the blame. I claimed that it was my fault. I was rushing the process. The locals were kind about my mea culpa, but they knew the real deal. And I heard again all the stories from 1991 about the U.S. wouldn't be there with them for the long term. In a lot of respects, they were right. We did recover from the election fumble. Najaf's economy started to boom with the reopened tourism due to the relative safety they were enjoying. This isn't to say we didn't have firefights in Najaf, but they were few and far between about the frequency you'd see of a police department in a major city. And they were focused on bad actors like gun runners, oil smugglers, Ba'athist insurgents, and criminals, the people of the city wanted us to go after. We were actually considered what was called a soft cover zone, which meant helmets and flaks were optional for our troops on the streets. And that was really rare in those days because the rest of the country was starting to experience insurgencies. And people wanted to figure out why. In 6 months, we had a fully functioning governing council. We had a vetted court system. We had peaceful transition of power in an impeachment. We had 24/7 electricity, open schools, improved water service, a thriving economy, free press, no losses to the enemy, thank God, and a crime rate comparable to any large U.S. city. Our civil affairs actually did a team actually did a survey, and they came back with a 90% approval rating for us as the government. What politician wouldn't give their right arm for that? We even caught the attention of 60 Minutes. And they sent Bob Simon out to see what was going on in Najaf. While interviewing some of my Marines about their experiences, he said, "I don't want you to take this wrong, but you were a bunch of Marine infantrymen, and now you're running a major city. You aren't trained to do that. So how are you making it work so well?" So one of my young guys, one of those 400 that came to us just before the war, shot out without hesitation because nobody told us not to. Gotta love an attitude like that. Our reward, by the way, was that we were the last Marine infantry battalion to leave Iraq. Bremer kept extending us until General Mattis finally convinced DC to allow us to turn over at multinational forces in 2003. So, let me pop out of this for 1 second. You just seeing me now? Okay. So, I guess that's the end of it, right? Because, you know, we did great stuff in Najaf and it's over. But it really isn't. Because after that, I left Iraq. I got a set of orders back to CONUS, to the continental United States. And I was able to actually use some of those soft power techniques that we were using in Iraq and actually influence other things. The first place I got sent was Joint Forces Command. It was called Multinational Interagency Experimentation. And there I got a chance to influence more than Iraqi province. We were developing prototypes for emerging warfare that included whole of government tools. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. We were developing a thing called the Joint Interagency Coordination Group, or JIASIC. This was a multidisciplinary team composed of people from all the agencies of the U.S., so State Department, Treasury Department, Commerce Department, and it was designed to help senior military headquarters make decisions with an interagency context. It was great. It wound up being something that we would link into all of the deploying headquarters, And it really had some impact because suddenly, instead of looking at the world through a little lens, a stovepipe, the military was able to hear all of the different issues going on with that particular country. The other thing we were doing was a biannual multinational experiment. Now, that gave us the opportunity to do the similar stuff with coalition interoperability and protocols. So, in this, we had multiple nations. The largest amount, I think, was up to 12. All the big players, Britain, France, Singapore, had just a plethora of folks, Australia, all participating. It was designed initially to do pre-operational training for going into Afghanistan. And we did that on the first couple of them. And then after we did that on a couple of these, figuring out protocols, figuring out ways to do joint planning, figuring out tough stuff like how to do share intelligence over common systems when you are in different coalitions. As a result, what we wound up doing was changing it to a larger setting. And the larger setting was the continent of Africa. That was the last game we ran before I left. And basically what we did was we said we're going to bring in a coalition, and we had multiple overlapping crises. Those crises included things like Ebola, collapsing governments, drought, starvation, armed conflict, bringing in all the various coalition players and figuring out whose strengths and weaknesses and writing a joint plan and creating a joint headquarters. Again, really cool stuff. I also had the chance to participate in several studies and panels: Defense Quadrennial Review, Defense Science Board, Counterinsurgency and Stability Operations Planning. And of course, a lot of the discussions were about Iraq, how we got there, what we were doing, and where we wanted to go. I was kind of the token man in the arena that had just come back from this deployment. That led to later collaboration with Ambassador Carlos Pascual, who was just opening the Office of Coordinator for Stability and Reconstruction State Department. And there I was brought in again as the operational guy to try and help them to develop interagency planning templates for stability and reconstruction protocols. Great work, lots of fun. So how does this translate to back home where I am now in Sac City? Actually, it does a lot. I mean, it's not like running Najaf, but close. I'll give you an example. So last summer, we all saw this tremendous civil unrest across the United States. Sacramento had the same thing. Legitimate protests were being hijacked by anti-government groups and criminals that were trying to cause disruption, destruction, violence, and looting. And they were hurting the protests because the legitimate messages were getting scrambled by these guys just trying to cause destruction. The goal of these anarchists was to draw police into violent confrontations. They used extreme harassment, antagonization, and weapons like bottles, rocks, batons, bear spray, even lasers shining into people's eyes to push boundaries and provoke overreaction. Our goal was to promote free speech, safely contain the civil unrest, and avoid loss of life and property. So we worked to contain the protests. We basically would put a bubble around them, for lack of a better term. And this was police on the outskirts of the protests, shutting down traffic and trying to cordon them into places where they could be safe and not be taken advantage by some of these anarchists. Every effort was made not to cause a CNN moment, but basically we used Aikido tactics, deflecting force and dissipating aggressive actions. We hardened critical infrastructure, removed targets, employed trusted community agents to talk to folks, basically separate the protesters away from the anarchists. And we purposefully rewarded those peaceful protests by allowing them to protest without permits as often as they wanted. Around the same time, we created a thing called the Department of Community Response. So this was a unique agency that would do alternatives to traditional police and fire responses. We purposely built this team of social workers and mental health clinicians, and they provided crisis response to events like homelessness, domestic violence, mental trauma, and drug addiction. So again, we chose the soft power approach to conflict to avoid potential escalation and loss of life. Okay, so if you'll indulge me, I'll finish with a story and finalize my example, and in some respect, finish my time with Moncada, sort of. So as my time was ending, CPA determined that al-Sadr was an enemy of the state and needed to be captured or killed. The mission was ours. We were his home province and the unit with the most intelligence on his whereabouts. There was no shortage of motivation for my Marines to plan and train for this mission, given how disruptive he had been to our operations. We developed multiple options to get him in a variety of locations and times, using specialized assault teams, helo-borne snipers, vehicle ambushes, even the local police. As we wargamed these raids, I was 100% confident that we would get him, but I estimated about a 50-50 chance he'd survive it. Once again, I was summoned to the Green Zone Palace in Baghdad to brief the Multinational Force Commander, General Sanchez, and Paul Bremer. General Sanchez and his staff were first. Heads nodded during the brief. All seemed fully in support of our plans. But my boss, Jim Natus, he knew I had a different opinion. So he coaxed General Sanchez to ask me what I thought about the mission. So I told him. I said, I have no doubt we will succeed in getting Sadr. However, our tactical success will create a tremendous strategic loss. Whether Sadr lives or dies, he will be deemed as a martyr for his cause in a tradition that holds martyrs revered above all others. It is better to contain and mitigate his stature, allow the religious elite to malign his credibility, while we fully develop the legal case against him for the murder of Al-Qawi. You could cut the air in the room when I finished talking. That was not what they expected to hear from the combat Marine. Sanchez took a long look at me, turned to his staff, and said, I agree with Chris. I'll advise the ambassador. The mission got put on the shelf. Shortly after, it became apparent that Sadr knew something, and he left for Iraq, went back to his spiritual mentor in Qum, Iran. Now, he's come back a few times, caused some trouble, but he never quite achieved the high stature and gravitas that he probably would have achieved as an imprisoned zealot or a martyred icon. I've taken criticism for that from some because I didn't do away with him. But I'm comfortable with it. Soft power was the right choice. Okay, I'm done yakking. If you guys want to ask questions, I would be more than happy to answer them.
Chris, that's great. I'm just going to pass it on. I've got some questions start to show up here. Nasser, you had a good question. Would you go ahead and ask Chris about that, what you had?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Chris. That was very interesting. Thank you for sharing your experience at that difficult time in Iraq anyway, and in Najaf in particular. I would like to hear your input on two events that you didn't bring in, which has some significance in the turn of events at the time anyway. The first one was the assassination of Muhammad Baqir al-Hakeem.
Yes.
At the doorstep of the shrine.
Yeah.
And the other one, well, I'm saying it's the second, but really it's the first one should be, it's the relation with you were the first to arrive in Najaf, and how did it play with the authority of Sistani, who is the supreme Ayatollah in Najaf anyway. Thank you.
Those are excellent questions. I will start with the second one first, if you don't mind. So some of you may be aware that actually we did not seize Najaf. It was the Army, the 101st Airborne. And there was an incident on the day of the seizure, but I think it was the second day, where the battalion commander at that time went to visit Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani. And in the course of moving his troops towards the Sistani's residence, they were surrounded by the residents and they started yelling at him, and it wound up with the battalion commander courageously, I think, stopping his troops and having them all take a knee, and then they backed off. When we got there, we were briefed on that, and basically what I said was, okay, what is sacred is sacred. Give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God. So I said to the residents, and particularly we started talking to some of the religious there, and I said, if you don't feel comfortable with my Marines in and around your religious center, which is around the Temple of Aman Ali, I am okay with that. I'm fine with that. We will keep the perimeter of the city. We will keep everybody out of those locations if that's what you want to do. Initially, that's exactly what they wanted to do. Now, later, they started having issues. Some of it was infighting between folks like al-Sadr's group and Dawa and Skiri and some of those different factions that were there. And when that started happening, they actually wanted us to start making a presence there. Now, I will tell you that it was a very light presence, and it was really to back up the Najafi police that we had and had trained. But they were at least a little bit more comfortable with us being there. I never had an audience with Grand Ayatollah Sistani. I did with Ayatollah Hakeem, a great man. I really appreciated it. It was early on. He had just come into the city back from Iran, and it was great to be able to sit down with him. And he was there as well as his brother, who later was in the governing council in Baghdad. It was a good discussion. Actually, I brought General Mattis to it. I think it, you heard me talk about the view from Baghdad and the fear of Skiri and the Bader Corps. I think that conversation and that relationship really helped us a lot because we no longer, well, I never looked at him as the enemy, but I was able to convince others not to. And I think we created a good working relationship with them. And also, it was interesting to watch Hakeem because he tempered his messaging a lot. When he first arrived, I compared it to the Second Coming. I mean, there were these huge groups of people that they sort of overdid it. That Hakeem was coming back to Najaf, and I think it offended a lot of people, like in Dawa, that had been there. After that, when he saw what al-Sadr was doing, and I think under the tutelage really of Grand Ayatollah Sistani, he tempered what he was saying, and he wasn't necessarily our best fan, but he at least appreciated what the U.S. was trying to do, and he became, in my opinion, a sort of a shadow backer of what we were doing. Sistani too was, an advocate of the things we did. Again, I never had an audience with him because I had heard that he might be uncomfortable with that. Literally the day before I left, it was mentioned to me by one of his emissaries that he was wondering why I never came to see him. And so there was obviously miscommunication, but we were able to get the message back that it was not because I didn't respect him. It was quite the opposite. I wanted to give him that ability to stay separate if that's what he wanted. Now, Hakeem's assassination, yeah, really ugly. That happened 2 days after I left. I was literally on a plane flying home. I left a little bit before my battalion. That's a whole nother issue that you heard me talk about Bremer saying that he extended us. Part of the reason why we were getting extended was Bremer knew me, I guess, and he wanted me to stay, even though I made no secret of the fact that I didn't like him. But he must have sensed I was some kind of a calming influence. It wasn't me, it was my guys. But he wanted me to stay specifically. And I had a set of orders I was supposed to do. At some point, Mattis basically said, look, I'm tired of this. Bremer's not going to meddle with the Marine Corps. You're going to go. We're bringing in the next battalion commander. And then 2 days after that, Hakeem was killed. I did a walkabout of the Aman Ali Temple 3 days before I left. I was in civilian clothes. One of the folks on the governing council simply wanted me to walk me around it and look at it. And I'll never forget, as I was walking in the front of it, I looked at it and I said, you guys really need to do something about your internal security because this is an accident waiting to happen. And to some respect, I wish I had never said that because when I saw Hakeem got blown up, it was like my worst nightmare. Now, he was blown up by a very sophisticated IED. We all have our theories on where it came from. My theory is that it came from the place he had left. That I think the folks that were sponsoring him back in Iran decided his message had changed and he had become a liability. It was way too sophisticated of an IED to come from al-Sadr, who had been, kind of an antagonist with them, and it was way too sophisticated for a lot of the other groups that were in Najaf at that time. So, yeah, horrible. Now, again, to kind of emphasize the soft power thing, I guarantee if we had not built the relationships that we had had in Najaf before that happened, that city would have imploded. It just would have been awful. It would have been ugly for the military there. My XO actually, when that happened, got taken hostage for about a day, and then was released because al-Sistani wanted him released. But they survived it well. There was actually no retribution against the military there. And what was allowed after that was a much stronger presence around the Imam Ali Shrine by the Marines that remained behind. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for asking that question.
Who's next? Is it me?
Yeah, you are. Go ahead, Farouk, you're next.
I am
Thank
next.
you. Colonel Conlin,
Wait a minute. Whoa. Let Farouk ask his question first. Bob, you're next after him.
okay.
Thank you, Bob. Really thank you very much for a very good presentation, because I was born and raised in Iraq. I've been here since 1962, but I was in Iraq on an assignment by a company, local company.
Yeah.
Between August 2003 and September of 2004, I spent about 7 months in Baghdad, and then the balance. Your situation is the fact you're dealing with an environment that is predominantly Shiite.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not predominantly, 99%, 90. Yeah, that's just the way it is. Both Najaf and Karbala are like that, and other places. The problem we had from day one is not the issue that we're going to defeat Saddam. It's the day after.
Yeah.
Okay. What's going to happen the day after?
Right.
The day after, we dissolve the Iraqi army. We dissolve the infrastructure on the basis that they are bastards, therefore they are no good. We have to get rid of them. All of a sudden, there's a military disappear, and the bureaucracy that runs the country is no longer there. And you can see that from day one. And the people I interacted with, not the professional, meaning not the people from the State Department or from the military, no. We're talking about the outsider, those who were assigned by the Congress, by political organization. They were a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
None of these people spoke the language, they know anything about the culture. And here we are in the middle of nowhere. And I can give you numerous examples about the problem I ran into when felt so bad about the soldiers on the other side of the green zone. And I spent literally all of my time in the green zone during that period of time. So this is really the problem.
Mm-hmm.
We dissolved things. We did not have any idea about what's going to come up. And I really appreciate the fact that the way you handled the situation, you brought the people in the picture, and then you did not dictate to them as much as they are the ones who wanted certain things to happen. Another person which I believe have done a very good situation was David Petraeus.
Yeah.
David Petraeus was up north in the Mosul area.
Yeah.
And he managed to really kind of control things and very peaceful. And that these are the concerns I have had from day one.
Yeah.
Is the quality of the people we sent over there, not the military, not the State Department people. No, I'm talking about other people. We dealt with the Iraq Reconstruction and Development Organization. The level of competence is absolutely a disaster. Yeah. I don't want to go any more than that. The other thing is that today, Iraq is under the control of Iran. They run the show, and it's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It doesn't mean no, it's not corrupt.
Farouk, I have to cut you off. We've got several questions in line here. We're running out of time. So
All right, very good.
thanks for your
Thank you
comments.
very much.
I think we're lucky. I think we were lucky to have Colonel.
Thank you. And for what it's worth, Farouk, I'm in 100% agreement. You know, a little bit less on the Iran thing right now, but yeah, 100% the problems that were caused by the way things were handled out of Baghdad. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob Ning, you're up.
Colonel Conlin, the soft power you experience in Najaf, I'm sure you agree, a large degree arise from the unity of faith in the Shia religious community that existed there.
It sure did.
Still exists there. And I want to extend this experience with Najaf to the religious soft power for peace currently rising in the Middle East among the underground churches in Iran, now in the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and I know the 50 million underground church members in China are even involved in Middle Eastern peace.
Yeah.
Do you sense a rise of possibility of soft power in unity and peace in that whole area in the perhaps near future?
So I do. Thank you very much for asking the question. You know, you're exactly right. One of the greatest benefits we had in Najaf was you had a fairly homogeneous society that it was a conservative religious town. And quite honestly, even though the Ba'athist infrastructure left, the Hausa, by virtue of being the leaders of their religious sect, provided great stability. And that was very helpful to them. Now, there were other religions there. I mean, there was a Greek church that was there. It was interesting when I was in Baghdad, actually, I ran into more Christians and various religions in Baghdad than I thought I would initially. I do believe that one of the reasons why we were successful was because I didn't, again, take the advice of Baghdad, nor did I take, it's interesting, this is a Small Wars Manual. It's kind of our Bible for doing this kind of stuff in the Marine Corps. But one aspect that it said not to do that we did was to have any discussions on a religious level. You know, I'm a Christian in Islam. I'm a people of the book. But I found I had better opportunity to talk to the people there when I recognized the fact that they were looking at things from the perspective of religion, and I engaged them that way, in an open way. You know, what do you think about this? Tell me about what you believe. And they were the first ones to tell me, the correlations between Imam Ali and, in their perspective, Jesus Christ, between Lady Fatima and the Blessed Virgin. They were very open with that. And when we talked to them that way, it was very helpful. For instance, I mentioned towards the end that when we turned it over, Najaf, we turned it over to a multinational coalition. So funny story with that again. I have to tell them this on the fireside chat, and I'm a little concerned. So I had this revelation. I say, oh, well, here's what I'll do. We're a stone's throw away from Babylon, from where the Tower of Babel was. We're going to talk about that. We're going to say, in ancient times, one homogeneous group building the Tower of Babel, and that was wrong, and God scattered those people across the world, and then they all spoke different languages. They're coming back. All the nations are coming back. They're coming back to Naja, to Babylon, and they are now going to help you rebuild. Man, people loved it. I mean, it was like I had just done a rock song or something. They liked that analogy until 2 days later. 2 days later, they found out that the unit that was taking over Najaf were the Spanish. Now, to me, I'm like, what's wrong with the Spanish? Oh, the Spanish can't come here. Why? Oh, come on. You know what happened. Well, what happened? 1,500 years ago, the wars, right? Spain. Come on, they can't be here. I'm looking at it like, well, wait a minute. A lot of water's gone under the bridge since then. Things have kind of settled down. I think it's okay. But again, they were looking at things in the cultural, religious context. And that was important to them, and if I didn't recognize that, I didn't have any success. Yeah, I think, in some of these countries like China and places where there's sort of the underground religious movements, they may get some traction, they may have some success. Definitely in Iraq, you sort of had a kind of 3 layers, right? Basemost were the tribes, I mean, they're very much the tribes, where they were, who they were, that was very strongly linked into the social network. And then you had the religion, right? Shia, Sunni, the Kurds up in the north, some of the Christian sects. And then you sort of had way up above that politics and nationalism. If you didn't start off recognizing the base layers, you're going to get nowhere with the politics up top. And that's why, I don't know if you noticed in that picture, unheard of. You never see this in our country, but you may have noticed that the individual who was sitting in the chairman's seat for that council that we had was a cleric. He was a mullah, right? Because when they chose their different groups, one of them was they wanted to have a religious representative. So the caucus picked this mullah, and guess what? He was elected as the chair of their governing council by all the other members, because that's what they wanted. Does that help?
All right, next question, Christine. We're into overtime now.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
That's okay, because I think a lot of the question was answered. I was also commenting on the unique demography of Najaf. And do you think that would have worked so peacefully if you were in Fallujah or Anbar or Abu Ghraib?
The Marine Corps, what I did, as I said, is sort of a template the Marine Corps has done before in other places. Not always, but at least it's a template we're familiar with. What I specifically did in Najaf was taken and trained to the battalions that came out later. And those battalions went to Fallujah and went to Ramadi, and they were basically in the triangle there, right? The triangle, the restive triangle. So, that's, again, there's something about being a Marine. They kind of send you to places like that. So initially they came in, my unit especially came in and were starting to do some of those things. But as you alluded to, it was a bit of a different environment. Now, some of that had to do with on the religious side, right? The Shia do have recognition of the Hausa, and and that Hausa does become sort of a unifying factor, like the Pope with Catholics, right? So that helps a little bit, right, in their social structure. Whereas for the Sunnis, it's a more decentralized thing, right? They don't have a central body that really dictates to them. And of course, the other stuff that was going on there, and it was alluded to earlier, I think, Farouk kind of mentioned it. Bremer made a horrible mistake when he disbanded the army. Most of the senior officials in the army were from Saddam's old hometown in Tikrit and Fallujah and Ramadi. The other factor that was up there that was a lot more prevalent than we had down south is there was an ancient economic smuggling highway that was between Al Anbar and right next door Syria, right? And that was open desert, a lot of stuff transported back and forth, not the least of which was warfare, warriors, and weapons, right? So that was a problem up there too. there was importation, exportation of terrorism. And we saw that. Now, interestingly, the Marine Corps kind of stayed on script. There was the horrific fight in Fallujah, which if you ever get a chance to pick up Jim Mattis's book, Chaos, he talks about how much he did not want to do that. They did not want to go in and go completely kinetic. They wanted to try what we had done down in the Southwest, but they were told to go in and then told to stop halfway in and then told to reattack a couple of years later. Lots of blood loss. But they did eventually get the old tactic to work, because when the awakening started, and you probably saw that, and probably during your time, that was that same thing of linking with the population, working with the tribes, trying to build up. Another great book that was written by Bing West is called The Strongest Tribe, and it talks about that. It talks about how they linked down as low as they could to the population, and then they were able to get it going again. Now, the shame of it was, after that, when we pulled out, then you had, you basically had it all go back to the way it was, right? So, and that was unfortunate. ISIS came in and it just turned ugly again. So, it's one of those things. I've always said, you don't win an insurgency. The best that you can do is manage it and get them to go legitimate politically. But you're never going to really win an insurgency. I mean, I'm an Irish guy. My relatives have been fighting the Brits over in Ireland and North Ireland for generations. It's starting up again. But if you tend to it, if you do some of those things that we were doing, if you marginalize people like Makata al-Sadr and folks like that, the rabble rousers, you just might be able to manage it.
We have a question from Colin Schneider.
Thank you so much for sharing your impressive story, Colonel Conlin, and thank you for your service abroad. My question would be, in hindsight, what should the foremost consideration be when utilizing soft power to implement a successful governance building plan, especially in a foreign or unfamiliar setting?
So Teddy Roosevelt said it best, right? Walk softly, carry a big stick. So all this stuff is high risk, when you do the soft power thing. So we got away with it and we did it, and it worked out really well. But you better bet the fact that I had 1,500 Marines there helped, right? It just did, because things can go sour on you really fast. And we just talked about that in Al Anbar and some of the other locations. So it's yin and yang, right? I'm an old martial arts guy, right? So, you deflect the strike and you go with the strike, with the hard punch if you have to. But the best is to deflect the strike and just be done with it. That's soft power. But you want to be able to have a reserve of hard stuff if you need it. That's the balance. And that's what, when I talk about guys like Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great, not a great tactician. Did some wild stuff and got away with it. But his greatest victories were like Baghdad, when he walked in and didn't have to shoot an arrow, didn't have to drive a sword through anybody. They convinced Baghdad to give up because the strong man had shown up. And then he worked with Baghdad, allowed them to continue their government, or Babylon, I'm sorry, allowed them to continue running a government, which, by the way, they've been doing it longer than anybody else. So I guess they kind of knew how to do it. And basically allowed the villagers and everything to do the kind of things they wanted to do. So he used a hell of a lot of soft power to manage a city that he didn't have to take with any force. But they knew he had the force there in case he had to use it. So I think that's the thing as military professionals, when you look at, when do I use hard power? When do I use soft power? It is always going to be a balance. Ideally, you go back to Sun Tzu and you win without fighting. But you better be ready to fight if it gets ugly. And if it does get ugly, try and figure out a way to win the fight as quick as you can so you can get back to the soft power motives.
Okay, one last question. Christina Slentz, go ahead, please.
All right, great. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much. It's been a long time since we crossed paths in Chesapeake.
Yes, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Yeah. So it was great to hear your discussion. And I am really interested in kind of the intersection of security and economics. And I know it's kind of a long question for the last one. Just briefly, as you were talking about that transition between soft and hard power, how does economics or strong development in your location influence that capacity to keep it in a soft power realm?
That's a great question. Very, very good. So a quote from Bono from U2, who said that free enterprise is the best solution, right, to poverty. And it's also a really good solution to disruption and instability. So one of the great things that happened in Najaf, and we talked a little bit about this, was, I mentioned we got power up and running, we established the rule of law, and those weren't things that Conlin came up with. My guys kind of figured that up as we were doing it, but it created conditions so that the economy could bounce back. And you can imagine how fragile that economy was if it was based on tourism, I mean, think a lot of the other places in Iraq had more defined economy, maybe the rice or things like that. There was some of that agriculture in Najaf, but most of the rice and all that were across the Euphrates over in Hilla and Babylon and those other localities. Najaf relied very heavily on that tourism and the religious, the visitors that came in to go to the schools and everything else. Even the 5,000, the mobile constituency that al-Sadr brought, when they came to Najaf, man, it was buying stuff in the stores, getting the gold from the market, getting food. I mean, to us, walking around Najaf may not seem like the French Riviera, but if you're coming out of a slum in Baghdad, it really was, So that was a huge help to us because we were able to harness the economy to then get jobs for people. I think it was somebody, Farouk, I think, mentioned the issue with the army. One of the reasons why that was so bad, the dissolution of the Iraqi army, was suddenly you had this vast swath of people that were 18 to about 35 years old that had no subsistence. They're out on the street, and you got to do something. You can become a gun runner. You can become a lot of them were doing things like oil smuggling. All of those horrible things. We don't want them doing that. We want them having good jobs. But you're not going to get a good job unless you have an economy to build that on. So by virtue of doing those early investments and creating the environment, we were able to amp up the economy sufficient that not everybody, but we had a good enough employment rate to get a lot of those guys out of the bad stuff and into the good stuff. And that really helped recreate that stability. Again, I kidded about, the rule of law and Hammurabi and, some of that, but I can't tell you how brilliant that was when they decided we should do it. You don't understand how important the rule of law is until you see ultimate anarchy. And then when you see anarchy and you see what that does to a place, then you get to understand, oh, okay, this is why societies got built. This is why, they had actual laws. This is why people took the time to write them on stone tablets and pass them around to folks, right? Because it really is essential as human beings to have some kind of rules in a society if you want to be able to function. Thanks for that great question, and very good to see you again.
Chris, I think you've done a fantastic job. This has been fascinating. I knew this was going to be good because I heard it when you initially talked a little bit about it at USD when I was taking that class up there. I'm going to just say a big thanks from everybody, and turn it back over to Christine and let her close it out.
Thank you. It was an honor and a pleasure. I appreciate you allowing me to share stuff.
We'll have you back. There's more to these stories, and maybe even a panel discussion talking in more detail. Civ Mill, and I know you worked with some of AID, USAID, and in fact, we talked about you worked with one of my AID girlfriends for some period down in Najaf. So some of those details, the good and the bad, will be interesting and fill in even more details for the members that are listening. So thank you so much for as much detail and on the ground understanding of that Civ Mill complicated relationship. And like you say, which one? I mean, AID, which is obviously Civ, was out there, but of course I didn't move without a gigantic military presence to protect me. And I did want that shout out in the chat to, and I'm sure it's on your behalf, to the Iraqis and the Iraqi Americans who were our interpreters, our bilingual, bicultural advisors. In AID's case, we also had many contractors. They were the ones that were going out into these really dangerous environments. And even a little bit of a comment as we're dealing with those issues right now in Afghanistan, when we've promised these interpreters in both countries who risked their lives, you know, to help us do what we did, that we can't abandon them. We can't abandon them. So thank you. I think I'll turn it over to Dennis Michael. We just have a couple of wrap-up slides. Mostly the emphasis is we'd like to see you all on the 8th of July, all of our members. And if there's anybody who's not a SDWAC member, please come on at 6:30 because we should have a really interesting soft power discussion about in the area of China, Mongolia, Nepal, and Afghanistan. So I'm sure that will be really interesting to everybody. So again, thank you so much, Colonel Conlin, and many thanks to Mike for reaching out to him in the first place and for mastering this process. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night to everybody. Appreciate it.
Good night.